Is David Brewster, and I'm from the National Security College at the Australian National University. And I'm really honoured to have been asked to chair today's discussion on strategic and economic dimensions, India and Australia and the Indo-Pacific, Quad and other developments. So this session has been organised by OP Jindal Global University and the Centre for India-Australia Studies, who are serving as the lead India partner university for India Week, organised by the Australia-India Institute. And we're lucky enough today to have two excellent speakers, Dr. Shishir Upadhyay and Pankaj from the Jindal School of International Affairs at the JGU. Professor Pankaj is, as I mentioned, at the Jindal School of International Affairs. He was formerly, some years ago, the research director with the Indian Council of World Affairs. Pankaj, with IDSA before then, correct? Yes. He was also acted as deputy director with the National Security Council Secretariat in India. He's authored two books, India and China in Southeast Asia, Competition or Cooperation, and India and Oceania, Exploring Vistas of Cooperation. So your presence here today is really great. Professor Upadhyay is a former Defence Intelligence Officer. He received his doctorate from the University of Wollongong in Australia and has a vast and diverse experience with the Indian Navy, industry, think tanks, and academia. Before his appointment as professor at JGU, he was research fellow at the National Maritime Foundation in New Delhi, adjunct faculty with the Defence Staff College, and associate professor at the Gujarat Maritime University. His latest book is Indian Maritime Strategy, Balancing Regional Ambitions in China, which was published by Routledge last year. So we've asked Dr. Upadhyay to talk about Indo-Australia strategic relations and how that's evolved over the last decade and the way forward. And Professor Pankaj will talk a little bit more about the Quad, correct? Yes. So I'll just say a couple of words just to frame the context of today's discussion. There's so many developments going on in the India-Australia relationship that it's often hard to keep up with them. We saw a virtual summit between Prime Ministers Modi and Morrison in June after the in real life summit was unfortunately delayed because of bushfires and then COVID, and that included the entry of the two countries into several agreements, including, at least from my perspective, most interestingly, a logistics sharing agreement, which really facilitates the two countries using each other's military facilities. We also saw the recent Quad ministers meeting in Tokyo, which was the first standalone meeting of Quad ministers, which included discussions on a whole range of issues, including COVID response, supply chain, resilience, and the supply of critical minerals. We also saw just last week the invitation of the Australian Navy to participate in the Malabar naval exercises, which are being held off the coast of India, I think in November. And in coming weeks, we're also eagerly awaiting, hopefully, fingers crossed, the release of the Indian government's Australia Economic Strategy Report, which was intended to complement and respond to the Australian government's India Economic Strategy, which was released in 2018. The Indian side of the equation was really finalised late last year and was intended to be released, but unfortunately, a number of events, including COVID, got in the way, and really COVID, I suppose, has requires a bit of a rethink of a number of aspects of economic engagement, and so I think that's what's really going on at the moment. I mean, overall, we should probably be very pleased about the trajectory of India-Australia relations, but we should also be careful not to overstate the importance of some of these developments. For example, the Australian participation in the Malabar naval exercises is a good development, but some would argue it's largely symbolic and it should really have happened some years ago without a lot of fuss, rather than waiting all this time. And so we should be careful in not overstating the substantive implications of it. We should also, I think, be sober about economic engagement. Certainly the two countries have a lot of aspirations for closer economic engagement, but they are more aspirations, I think, than implementation. Bilateral trade has certainly been growing between the two countries, and I think reached 21 billion in two-way trade, Australian dollars in two-way trade in 2018-19. But the growth in trade hasn't been remarkable, and indeed the 2018-19 numbers was actually a little bit lower than the previous year, and indeed we should probably be expecting falls in trade in education services this year due to the effect of COVID. So overall, certainly the relationship is heading in the right direction, and certainly in the political and defence side, but it still has a long way to go. And I'll be very interested to hear from our distinguished speakers your views on the history and future of the relationship between the two countries. Professor Upadhyay, you?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. I hope you're able to see my slides, David.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for confirming that. So, good afternoon, everybody. And at the outset, let me first express that we at the Jindal Global University are delighted to be the lead India partner university for the Australia-India Institute. And this session is part of specially curated series for the India Week. So over the next 15 minutes, I will talk about the India-Australia bilateral strategic partnership and looking at some of the recent developments and try and analyze what this means for both our countries and how it could evolve in the future. So on 4th of June, the first ever India-Australia Leaders Virtual Summit was conducted between Prime Ministers Modi and Scott Morrison. In addition to being the first virtual summit, this was also probably one of the most productive summit level talks. And some of the highlights are as shown on my slide. I think the first and the foremost development has been that our bilateral ties have now been elevated from a strategic partnership that was concluded in 2009 under Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to a comprehensive strategic partnership. The next has been, this joint statement which says that all these agreements are based on a shared vision for maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region based on a free, open, inclusive, and rules-based Indo-Pacific. I think this is a very important statement, and it gives us confidence that this will be a very long-lasting and enduring relationship because it is based on shared, values. And I believe these values are actually more enduring than national interests, which may actually change with time. Another important highlight has been that both the countries have agreed to maintain ASEAN centrality and coordinate their efforts in the various multilateral fora under the rubric of ASEAN, which includes the ARF, the ADMM, and several other institutions, as also the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, and various agencies find mention. This takes me to the next point on the Indian Ocean Pacific Initiative. This was an idea which was first advocated by Prime Minister Modi in 2019 at the East Asia Summit in Vietnam. Now, we really don't know what this actually means, but it seems to me that this will probably involve, the creation of new set of institutions, or maybe a merger of some existing institutions. And this is an area where India and Australia could collaborate. And I will talk about this a bit more in the subsequent slides. Moving on to some other highlights, defense cooperation, which has been one of the pillars of our relationship. The two countries have signed a mutual logistics support agreement, which, amongst other things, allows our navies to use our naval bases for refueling, repairs, etc. And this kind of helps to expand the reach of the navies. There's also talk of cooperation in defense science and technology, and a role for India in the Indo-Pacific, in the Pacific Island Cooperation Forum. Outside of defense cooperation, there have been agreements related to science, technology, and research collaboration pertaining to COVID, cybersecurity, 5G networks, etc. There's also, agreement to have a 2+2 format defense and foreign minister talks every 2 years. I think Australia is only the third country after US and Japan with whom India has signed this agreement. So this is really a very important development. Now, there are several other things which I have not included here on my slide, but going through that list of agreements that have been signed, it's there on the MEA portal. I got the sense that almost everything that was on the table has actually been approved and agreed to. And the timing and, the speed at which these agreements have been signed leave no doubt that this is to do with the ongoing tensions with China along the LAC, as also aggressive Chinese behavior that we've seen in South China Sea, in the Pacific Islands, around Australia, and all of that. So I'll move on. These are some other developments which have happened following the summit. Firstly, the Quad ministerial meeting in Tokyo in October, early October, and most recently an announcement that Australia will now rejoin the Malabar after I think 2006 or 7 when it participated for the first time. So I will not dwell on this too much because the next speaker is going to cover this. Let me go back to our bilateral relations. And we can see based on all these developments that, we've kind of reached the highest level of strategic engagement in our history. And while it has a lot to do with, the Chinese aggressive behavior that we've seen along the LAC and South China Sea, as I said, it is not something which has happened overnight. And I think these developments are the result of a massive push from Australia. And what we've seen is over the last 2 decades, Australia has pursued its political and strategic engagements with India as a matter of national priority. And this seems to have received bipartisan support within the government in Australia. And for example, you see from 2006 to 2014, there were 4 Australian prime ministers who visited New Delhi. There's none from India, except Prime Minister Modi, who visited Canberra, I think 2014, 2016, after a gap of almost 30 years. So clearly there's been a lot of push from Australia and not so much of a pull from New Delhi. I think another factor which has facilitated this level of cooperation has been the shift in India's foreign policy and the move away from non-alignment towards multi-alignment or issue-based alignment, as the foreign minister likes to call it, to establish loose working arrangements with convergent powers. I think one more important factor has been how India's view of the Indian Ocean region has evolved. Uh, Post-independence, India's view of the Indian Ocean region was largely influenced by what K.M. Panikkar, a diplomat, one of foremost maritime thinkers, had advocated that the Indian Ocean must remain truly Indian. And actually that led to India's call for keeping the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. And this was a position which was maintained for a long time. In fact, as late as 2018, I remember the Indian NSA, the National Security Advisor, speaking at the Gaul Dialogue in Colombo, had reiterated this position. But recent developments seem to suggest that India is now open to foreign and extra-regional powers moving around in the Indian Ocean region. For instance, if you look at the logistics sharing agreements that have been signed, uh, India has signed logistics agreements with the United States, Japan, even Russia, France. Then another development has been the Milan 2020 exercise, which actually was scheduled in March this year, but got cancelled because of COVID. If you look at the invitation list, it includes large number of extra-regional navies who would have been invited to participate in that military exercise. So I think these developments tell us that for India, I think the idea that the Indian Ocean region can be a zone of peace is probably a quaint idea whose time is now past. Now, what does this relationship mean for India and for Australia? I think for India, first and foremost, it helps to build trust amongst the Quad partners. It is very important for these four democracies to show a strong resolve to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific as a counter to the Chinese position. So to that extent, this is a very important development. Secondly, I spoke about the Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative. Now, this is an idea which is a recent idea which came up only last year when Prime Minister Modi mentioned this at the East Asia Summit. But I think what we have seen so far is that there were two distinct regions, the Indian Ocean region and the Western Pacific. And accordingly, each of these regions had their own set of institutions. So for example, you had the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium for the Indian Ocean Navies, and you had the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, or the WPNS. And similarly, there are other institutions. I think under the IPOI, there is potential for creation of new institutions, maybe through a merger of the existing agencies, or there is potential to collaborate with all the countries of the region to create a new set of institutions which will help promote maritime governance. And this is an area where India and Australia can work very closely. Australia, for example, is one of the leading navies who are members of both IONS and the WPNS. There are other institutions such as the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission or the Indian Ocean MOU for port strait control. And if we are able to network these organizations and kind of or create new institutions, that could essentially provide the framework for this concept of the Indo-Pacific region, which is kind of diffused currently. As regards military assistance, I don't think India is looking at any military assistance, not at least bilaterally from Australia, and neither is Australia looking at similar security or military assistance from India, because they have their own security alliance with the United States. So this is not an area which of area of focus in our bilateral relationship. To look at now what's in it for Australia, I think firstly, this relationship helps Australia to diversify its diplomatic and strategic relations away from the United States. I remember, the Australian High Commissioner to India, one of the former Australian High Commissioners to India, speaking at a conference in Delhi, And he was telling us that since 1968, when the British effectively withdrew from the east of Suez, Australians have suffered from a sense of strategic anxiety. And I think it's probably taken 50 years, but now they've realized that they need to prepare for a unipolar world or a decline in the US power. I think I would think that we are already in a post-unipolar world, and Australia needs to prepare for that. And therefore, a partnership with India allows them to diversify their diplomatic and political relationships. As regards trade, India India is not the largest trade partner. China is the largest trade partner for Australia. But if you look at this graph, Australian exports to India have actually doubled in the last 10 years. And potentially, as a growing economic power, India can, Australia can cultivate India to be a trade partner. And we will see growth in India bilateral trade. More importantly, I think this partnership allows Australia to realize some of their regional ambitions. Now, we've seen if you parsing of the Australian white papers indicates that Australia has for a long time nursed certain latent ambitions to play a larger role in the Indian Ocean region. To be fair, the Australian Navy the Australian Defence Force have participated in Afghanistan. They have participated in the anti-piracy patrols. But those operations have largely been as a subordinate US partner. And it seems that Australia may have some latent ambitions to play a larger role alongside India. And we have seen in recent months, things like the exercise Endeavour, which was conducted last year involving the Sri Lankan Navy, Southeast Asian navies. This is the first time that we've seen the Australian Navy actually operate in South Asia, which has traditionally been India's sphere of influence. So this kind of suggests that we will see more of Australia trying to play a larger role in the region, which is welcome because it helps to balance Chinese influence, growing Chinese maritime power. I'll conclude with some final thoughts. I think this bilateral defense cooperation, which is now technically the same level as India's bilateral relationship with the United States, it has I think the only difference is that it has an additional prefix called Comprehensive Global Strategic Partnership, but otherwise it's the same level as the partnership with the United States. But I don't think India's defense cooperation with Australia will probably acquire the same depth and scope as with the United States. So therefore, to that extent, in many ways, we've kind of reached a plateau. But I think there is huge scope for engaging jointly with the ASEAN states, which have actually faced the brunt of growing Chinese economic and political influence. And many of the smaller states, Cambodia, Laos, Brunei, etc., they've lost their agency, because of this interference from China. And I think unless the major players like Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, Singapore are supported jointly by India and Australia, it is possible that ASEAN institutions may actually weaken. And this is an area where India and Australia, both being major stakeholders, can collaborate effectively to counterbalance growing Chinese influence in the ASEAN forum. This relationship, allows Australia to play a larger regional role and realize some of their aspirations. But I think as a comprehensive strategic partner for India, Australia will now have to be mindful of India's strategic concerns and India's sensitivities. For example, things like inviting Pakistan to participate in Kakadu or to have any such plans to expand Endeavour, wherein they involve other navies of the region. I think these are factors which need to be considered by Australia. And finally, I'll end by saying that although the COVID has, the pandemic has posed several major challenges, it has also provided a lot of opportunities for our relationship to go beyond defense cooperation. And I think in the post-COVID world, we will see our bilateral relationship blossom in diverse fields. So on that note, I will end here and hand over to David. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really comprehensive discussion. Thank you very much. Okay, just time is short, so we'll move on to Professor Jha. And you don't have a presentation, do you?
I don't know. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Okay. At times, it helps if you don't have a presentation, because technology at times gets stuck and you are stuck in your thought process. Okay. So I'm trying to really get over it, but just it's trial. Thank you, David. Thank you for being among the friends, especially for a panelist. You should know the chair much better. So it gives you a confidence. And second, Australia-India Institute. And thank to organizers to really bringing this thing on. My previous panelist has already outlined what exactly is the relationship, status of relationship with Australia. So I will be focusing primarily with regard to three major factors, and how this Indo-Pacific is really evolving, and how subscription is going on, and how Quad needs to really calibrate its position in the international scheme of things, and whether these new structures which are coming up, one of these is Quad Plus and many others, which might really take shape in due process itself. So what we are really seeing, there is a concentration of concepts and strategic priorities which are hobbling, for more attention. And also the tension of the international community is primarily with regard to any of the meetings which is happening among the Quad members, or for that matter, there is a particular strategy paper which is outlined by many of the European countries very briefly itself. So what exactly is happening with regard to Indo-Pacific, how Quad will be shaping up? Now, when we look into the Indo-Pacific, it was seen more of a geopolitical imagination, but it has now increasingly been sought by the European countries, by India, by Australia, that it's a possible solution or a possible construct which can address issues and challenges related to core security issues. If you look into all these formations across Asia, you look into South Asia, SARC is still not really moving ahead with the momentum it was expected to. Other like Northeast Asia don't have a forum which can really address their cause. So invariably it comes on the openness of ASEAN to address few issues through a number of organizations that they have. But now we see that Indo-Pacific is seen as a one rule-based order proposition, which might really gel many of the countries which are democratic, which vie for a rule-based order, freedom of navigations, and peace and stability per se, needs to be really evolved in that case itself. Now, there is also questions which have been raised with regard to inclusivity of Indo-Pacific, because when Prime Minister Modi made a statement during Shangri-La dialogue that it should be an inclusive concept, that then many of the strategic thinkers started alluding to the fact that maybe China has been latently asked to really join this concept. But then the whole question really comes to the thing that what exactly are the conditions, and whether China as a country is fulfilling those conditions to be a part of this Indo-Pacific construct, and whether it has the commitment and the resolve to abide by those decision making, and which is through participation and democratic fundamentals per se as such. We have seen Quad also 1.0 2007, and now Quad 2.0, which has evolved over a period of time, which includes much more tangible outlook, and also how it is really going to pan up in near future. In fact, India welcomes Australia's engagement in Malabar exercise because of the two major reasons. First, Australia overlooks two of the major critical strategic straits which pass through the Indonesia itself, the Sunda and Lombok, and also given the volume of trade which is going to increase, it might be possible that these straits might be an important, and their security might be of important thing in the near future. Now, when you look into the Quad 2.0 and look into the dialogue and discussions which is going on, I would like to highlight that what exactly is the basic futuristic template that can really evolve in the case of Quad 2.0. I strongly believe there are four major sectors which are going to come up in the case of Quad. The one is with regard to space, because the space is one area where Australia is also really trying to build its capacities and jump into the space arena per se as such. Cyber is another aspect. Intelligence sharing and data sharing is critical, and encrypted communication networks, because now we will be signing DICA with the US and maybe tomorrow itself, clearly outlining that how we are really going to look into our relationship with US and other Quad members per se as such. Now, when talking to the Quad itself, I strongly believe that there is a need for a cohesive understanding and setting out a blueprint with regard to what should be the Quad priorities in future, or it will die a very uncertain death as it has happened in the case of Quad 1.0. But the problem which I foresee is with regard to political dispensation in each of the countries, because they have a priorities, they have a domestic constituency which they have to address, and at times Quad has to cater more to the domestic priorities rather than the international commitments or the regional security aspect per se as such. I also alluded to this fact that ASEAN centrality, how much it is critical for the Quad, or is it compulsory for the Quad members to address ASEAN centrality? I would take my two cents on this aspect, that till the time East Asia Summit is not formalized, ASEAN centrality will remain as the fulcrum, or if there is another institution like Indo-Pacific security institution or something of that which comes into being, then I believe ASEAN centrality will be under duress and much stress, which might be really seen in this case. There has been talks that with regard to certain economic aspects, particularly RCEP, that India is not joining, and there are certain frictions with regard to the members which are willing to make India join this configuration as such. I believe India will again come back to negotiating the trade deals with the countries which have been somehow impacted because of India not joining RCEP, because in the end the rules of origin and how India really looks into China making a via media to really enter the Indian market is non-negotiable, and India is not going to compromise on that. Uh, Also, if you look into this Quad and Quad Plus, the one important aspect which again germinates in the discourse itself, whether it will be reinvention of the hub and spokes model, where Quad becomes the core and Quad Plus becomes a regional spokes which cater to the Quad ambitions and objectives itself. The logistic pack and the agreement with the Professor Shishir also talked about is opens a new vistas, new avenues for cooperation in a number of ways for all these countries. HADR is one, response mechanism, and also addressing those marine challenges which might be really there. Something when the more potent aspect with regard to blue economy, exploring resources, marine resources, will be also taking shape, and this critical minerals and rare earths might be one area where this might be really taking shape as such. There has been trilaterals which are also taking shape. We see Australia, Japan, India, maybe many other trilaterals might be also in the horizons. It might be possible that Australia, Indonesia, and India is already in there, and many more trilaterals might be really complementing this whole pursuit of regional peace and stability in future. One of the propositions that was proposed by Prime Minister Modi was JAI, which is Japan, America, and India together, which is JAI. If you add Australia into it, Ajay, which becomes AJAI, Ajay. In Hindi parlance, Ajay means be goodwill to you, you be the great. Ajay means invincible. So I believe when Australia comes on board, this Quad becomes invincible. So that is basically, if you ask any person who knows Hindi, so he will translate it to what is the meaning of Ajay as such. We have seen there is a deluge of structures, and because of the deluge of structures across spectrum in this region, we find delays, and also decision making has been tardy. And because we belong to such a structures, that we, at times taking decision is a long way process itself. There is also clash of markets, investment, and the problem with regard to integrating these markets into a wider network, which primarily includes services as such. India's primary attention is how it can really progress its manufacturing and services to other market across. Very lately, the MEA, the Ministry of External Affairs, also instituted a department which is known as Division of Oceania, which incorporates Indo-Pacific, ASEAN all together into it. So we have tried slightly taking that indirect route to building a more free and open Indo-Pacific per se as such, but this route is indirect, so as there is not so much criticism which India will have to bear, because very lately there is a lot of criticism in the domestic constituency that India is getting into the US orbit, and it should not be very good for the so-called strategic autonomy of India in the long run itself. India is also taking with regard to capability planning and all those things, which is again work in progress itself. Quad meeting also talked about resilient supply chains, and I think that is a critical area which needs due attention. India, with regard to India's policies with regard to cybersecurity, India is likely to come up with a national cybersecurity strategy, which was delayed because earlier it was likely to be proposed in July 2020, but it will be seeing the light of the day very soon itself, I believe so. I would like to propose, in the end of my lecture itself, two basic things. First is, when we talk about Quad, there is a need for a Quad grid. And what do I mean by Quad grid? That you integrate those bases, those places which can be the first call for attention in case there is a problem, or if in case there is a crisis. I propose something like Djibouti, Diego Garcia, Andaman, Darwin, Guam, and Okinawa as creating one grid, which might be known as Quad grid, which proposes that since we have logistic pact, which we have cooperation across spectrum, so maybe we can really work on that. The second proposition, which I definitely want, that the Quad partners, and when we work on Indo-Pacific and all those aspects, there is a need for a blueprint and also a joint document which should highlight which are the areas, at least as a common denominator, that all the Quad countries can agree to it. And this will be critical for developing larger pictures itself. India has been looking for into Five Eyes project. Japan might be really finding an entry into it. Maybe there is another proposition which might be critical, that why not Quad can create its own intelligence network, which can be sharing intelligence on an exclusive platform, helping it build certain synergies in this field. I rest my case over here. Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pankaj. It's an excellent presentation, and I think you've certainly given me a number of really good ideas. So thank you. Now, just in terms of questions, we've got, if anyone wants to ask a question, I think you just type it into the chat function and that comes up, and then I'll read it out. So subject to people asking questions, I'll take the privilege of the chair to ask you both some questions. Firstly, Shishir, you spoke, I think, I mentioned a couple of times in your presentation about the potential or need to rearrange various institutions based in the Indian Ocean, including IORA and IONS. And I think it's no secret that IORA has performed less well than many would have hoped. IONS possibly is in a different category, but nevertheless, it's clear that there is a lack of strong regional institutions in the Indian Ocean. Would you be able to share with us any thoughts that you might have, Shishir, about what you would like to see as institutions in the Indian Ocean and the roles that India and Australia could play in helping to build that?
Well, yes, I think when you talk about free and open Indo-Pacific, we're only talking about the movement of shipping and trade, and therefore that comes to maritime governance. Now, if the Indo-Pacific countries are able to ensure that the movement of shipping is free and safe, then I think what should I say? The Indo-Pacific region can actually be a viable construct, and therefore, in order to have, there's a need to have institutions which actually promote the maritime safety and security. Now, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium was an agency which came up to tackle common maritime threats, piracy and things like that. And there are similar institutions to prevent illegal fishing, which is also a common challenge in the Western Pacific region. There's also an institution for port state control and network of various ports in the Indian Ocean region, which can be expanded to cover the Pacific, the Western Pacific at least. And therefore, you are able to ensure that maritime safety and security is ensured in terms of port state control inspection and stuff like that. So my idea was that if India and Australia could work together, India and Australia are both major players in most of the institutions of the region. And if we are able to kind of collaborate with, institutions in the Western Pacific, regional fishery management organizations, RFMs or something, I think is that acronym, Indian Tuna Organization, which is one of the lesser known fishing management organizations. If they were to join hands, I think that could help to improve illegal, Indian Ocean's record in illegal fishing. Things like that. IONS and WPNS is another area where these two institutions could be linked. There is already, in terms of, if you look at Coast Guard, there is already an organization called, I think, forgetting that acronym, that heads of Coast Guard HACSM or something, which is founded by Japan, that involves most of the regional Coast Guards in the Indo-Pacific region. So when you have organizations like this in place, and at some stage even China could be invited to participate and contribute, you're at least able to ensure that the shipping and the trade lines are safe and secure. I think that is, if you're able to achieve that itself, gives some shape to the entire the region, and it kind of involves everybody. And if you have a multilateral effort like that, there's very little chance that China can actually put a spoke into these issues. So I think that's what I was thinking when I spoke about IPOI. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very good idea. Pankaj, you mentioned a couple of times the Quad Plus, and pondered about how it would all fit together, perhaps a hub and spoke arrangement or some other arrangement. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what are the other 1, 2, 3 key countries that are the plus in your view, and how you would see them ideally connected with the 4 existing Quad countries.
Okay, thank you, David. When you talk about the Quad Plus, the configuration now is like Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand per se as such. But somewhere down the line, I feel that Indonesia is being left out, because it is critical when we talk about global maritime program. Its expense, geographic expense. It might not have been such a great military or a navy per se as such, but the geographic location, the vantage point that Indonesia has is very critical at this point of time. Singapore has been sitting on the fence. It is just not taking sides, which is very sensitive. I give that credit to Singapore because it looks into China and US as 2 big opportunities for them itself. But I strongly believe that New Zealand is already there, but Vietnam, Indonesia can be critical in this whole schema of things, and that needs to be looked into it. But how this regional configuration will pan out in near future needs to be seen purely from Quad, its own policies, its objectives per se as such. And I believe it will be really panned out in future, that which countries are technically very strong and do subscribe. I don't say that we can force anybody or compel anybody to join this kind of a configuration. If they are willing subscribers to this Quad Plus configuration, we welcome them. And that will be the bigger strength that will be evolving in near future in that scheme of things. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, there's a question from the floor that I'll invite you both to answer. If you could please, so we can try and fit a number of questions in, if you could just keep it to maybe a couple of minutes, your answers. A good question. How susceptible is the Quad to Chinese tactics of divide and conquer, or divide and rule, as we've seen with ASEAN? Is China going to try and use that strategy? Well, we can assume that they probably will, but how successful do you think they would be? And if I could ask Pankaj to go first on that one.
if you look into this whole, configuration of China really enticing, I will use the word enticing the ASEAN members to really side by it. And we will find Myanmar also, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand also taking a different position depending on their equation with China itself. But now, if you look into it with regard to different countries itself, the unity that the ASEAN has shown when Malaysia represented its case with regard to extended continental shelf and the support which has been garnered from Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia. I believe these countries have clearly seen that China cannot be a completely reliable partner, particularly in security and strategic aspects of it, and they might be really willing into this next alternative, because that has been seen in the case of Southeast Asia. Because if you go into the history, Japan was the primary, the player in this Southeast Asia before China chipped in. And when China is trying to really make its ways, particularly with regard to South China Sea, and really intimidating all the ASEAN claimant countries in a way which is not acceptable to I will use the minions of the ASEAN itself, I think it is already losing that goodwill which was there. And second aspect with regard to code of conduct, I don't think China is very serious with regard to agreeing to any of these aspects with regard to code of conduct, and invariably they will have to come back to some security guarantor per se as such, whichever can provide them that guarantee. It might be US or a group of countries which can gel themselves together and work in this aspect as such. But ASEAN technically is under stress because it is not able to address those core security issues, which is because it has a constraint with regard to consensus and non-interference and resolving issues through peaceful methods. So I think there is certain constraints which ASEAN has to grapple with, and it will pan out how much commitment that the Quad countries or the countries which are inimical or not seeing China as a good friend as such, how they really project their objectives and their commitment to the cause. It depends on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Shishir, what your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I don't believe that China will be in a position to kind of break the Quad as such. And it is more likely that they'll try and weaken the ASEAN, something that they've been working on for some time. And it's possible that we may see ASEAN lose its centrality, although that is an area of focus for all Quad members. But it's possible at some stage that ASEAN may be significantly weakened and they may kind of swing towards China. But it's unlikely that we'll see a kind of a rapprochement between the US or the China, or the US, China and India. We're talking about a Cold War intensifying between US and China. So things are only going to, I think the Quad is only going to get strengthened in the coming years, in the near term. And it is the ASEAN which will actually get weakened, not the Quad.
Right, thank you. That's very interesting. Okay, next question. It's just to Shishir. Does the Indian Navy have the capability and intent to safeguard the entirety of the Indian Ocean, or is it necessary to work with other partners? And if so, what would be the respective roles and responsibilities of other partners?
I think the Indian Navy is now a very major maritime power and a force to reckon with in the Indian Ocean region. And our stated maritime strategy is to be the net provider of security. Compared to all the other regional littoral countries, which are very small navies, we are the largest navy. And India has actually provided security to several countries, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Seychelles, Mauritius. India has intervened at various times from the 1980s. And we are seeing now increasingly Indian Navy being very active in providing humanitarian aid, disaster relief in HADR operations in Africa, in Middle East, and various parts of the region. So there's no doubt that the Indian Navy really has the capacity, and that's the reason why it is part of a maritime strategy. And now with a growing partnership with the United States, that kind of only supports that supports and facilitates our role. And this is something which has also been acknowledged by the United States in their quadrilateral strategy, that they they kind of support India's position as the net security provider. So India has both the capability and the intent to do that. And this is something which has been going on for several years now.
Okay, thank you very much. Would the panelists please be able to specify any specific opportunities for greater cooperation in the defence area between Australia and India? I'll go to Pankaj first on that one.
Okay. When you look into this collaboration and cooperation itself, both the countries have defense technology cooperation with, you have DTTA, defense technology cooperation with US, we have defense technology initiative per se as such. There are very many areas which we can really definitely work on, particularly with regard to developing radars, beyond visual range missile systems, or those where we find there is a market for us to really look into the high weapons grade sort of instrumentations and platform itself. And we are definitely looking into developing these joint ventureship. We very lately we have gone to Indonesia to look how their defense industry could be taking up few of the orders from us, and this was really explored. Maybe these kind of initiatives can be also engaged through this defense research organization between Australia and India very in near future. In fact, in the past, we have done something like that. So it depends on which are the areas that we can definitely look into it. Maybe futuristic weapon system, maybe those systems which can be really benefiting the armies of both the countries in very conflict zones or war situations per se as such. Thank you.
Thank you. Shishir, do you have anything to add on that? I noted that you thought that the defence cooperation might plateau between Australia and India. Is there any specific areas that you think might be fruitfully explored that haven't yet been explored?
In terms of military hardware, sale, purchase of military hardware, I don't think there's so much of scope between the two countries because both of us have our separate strategic agreements with the United States. In fact, the United States is one of the major suppliers to India, as also to Australia. So to that extent, in terms of defense hardware, we may not see much cooperation, but there is opportunities in, as I said, for collaboration in terms of various institutions in the region and maybe joint exercises and things like that. So not so much pertaining to military hardware. But of course, under the Quad and on the Malabar, we will see greater compatibility between our systems because chances are that Quad may actually evolve into a defense alliance. And to that extent, we might be alliance partners working in cooperation, very close cooperation. So there might be some evolution of, which will promote compatibility between our various weapon systems and stuff like that. But that's something in the long term.
Thank you. And I'll just take the opportunity to add that when we're talking about this area, we shouldn't just be focusing on the pure defence, as in ships and planes and the like, but actually far more important in many ways is intelligence cooperation. And that's certainly Australia's experience, having participated in the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement for 70 years or so. That is one of the key ways of leveraging and increasing power. Now, intelligence sharing isn't easy. It's difficult, it requires a lot of trust, but it actually has, in many ways, can have far bigger payouts than, a naval exercise or some other exercise, important as they are. So I would just throw that little thing into the mix as well as something that really can have a lot of value between the two countries. I'll ask a question put forward by Pradeep Taneja from the University of Melbourne. Glad to have you participating, Pradeep. He says recently a former permanent secretary of Singapore Foreign Ministry said that ASEAN may have to drop Laos and Cambodia from the organisation. Do you think that this is something that might make ASEAN a more effective organisation in realising ASEAN's centrality in the Indo-Pacific? I'll principally put this to Pankaj because I think this is possibly more squarely in your area, but Shishir, if you would like to say a few words on it as well, by all means. So Pankaj, what your... your views?
Thank you. Thank you. It's an interesting question, but I would like to address it from three prongs. First, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation has been completely thrown out of the window by the China. So if ASEAN does have the guts, kindly throw the dialogue partner China out of the scheme of things, and then you don't have to throw Laos and Cambodia out. The first criteria is this. Second, if even if the ASEAN thinks about shedding this Laos and Cambodia out of the window itself from the ASEAN configuration, I don't think there will be much effect with regard to ASEAN, because ASEAN has progressed and engaged all these countries into this fold. But you should really address the root cause of the problem for creating differences within the ASEAN structure itself. And I believe China is the one culprit. Right since 2012, Cambodia summit, where communique wasn't really floated as such, because there has been a lot of frictions between Philippines, Vietnam, and Cambodia on the issue itself. And with regard to ASEAN centrality, I think ASEAN does have limitations, and these limitations ASEAN will have to look into itself from an introspective point of view, because they have addressed whatever the challenges had come in the past when they developed the ASEAN Charter. They worked out on a more cohesive unit, address those challenges which might be emerging for the organization in future. I think again the time has come to take a stock taking of ASEAN, and I believe the ASEAN nations could themselves take what exactly is the lacune and the deficit with regard to their decision making and their larger picture that they want to see ASEAN in future per se as such. I rest my case over here. Thank you.
Thank you. Shishir, did you want to say?
A very interesting question, I think, but dropping Laos, Cambodia is really not going to help anybody, because if you start dropping countries like that, then it could be in Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, who knows, Philippines, and we may see the ASEAN actually disintegrating. So I think there is a possibility that if you're able to shore up and prop up some of the larger players such as Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, Singapore, if they are propped up by collaboration between Australia, India, and the United States, backed by the United States, we might still be able to maintain some level of autonomy, some agency with ASEAN. Otherwise, it is more likely that we will see some of the smaller players, as they have already capitulated towards China. So yes, there has been a weakening, and at best we can try and preserve some integrity within ASEAN, but nothing more. And I don't think the future is very bright for ASEAN, if you ask me.
Thank you, Shishir. Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to again use the privilege to ask you both a question. There's been, I think both of you might have mentioned that about the need for the Quad to prioritise what's important, what needs to be done, etc. And that's really been lacking somewhat in the past. If you had to choose 3 or 4 things that would be the key priorities of the Quad, what would they be? The most immediate things that they need to do, the deliverables, or the areas that they should be focusing on. And maybe Shishir, if I could ask you to start with that.
Yeah. So
Sorry
I think
the
2 or 3 points that come to mind is firstly, logistics. I think India has already signed bilateral agreements with all the players. So having a logistics network which automatically includes bases, bases of places. So that's one, a network of bases is automatically created within the Quad members. Then commonality of equipment in terms of interoperability, something that will promote interoperability. I think this is something which can be achieved through exercises. And Malabar promises to be a kind of a Quad, a quasi, alliance between the Quad members, where all these things will be experimented and tried out, and some kind of common strategy like we've seen with the NATO. So I think the Malabar could probably take that direction, and we may see some tactical, procedures that may evolve through the Malabar. So logistics, tactical equipment, and then intelligence sharing. Yes. So I think intelligence sharing is another area where, again, there are bilateral agreements, and this needs to be concretized and formalized so as to have a common sharing arrangement, which may take a different form. An entirely new organization or an arrangement could be created outside of the Five Eyes or anything else that the different players may have. But
Yes.
purely from the military point of view, yes, these are three things.
Okay, thank you very much. That's Pankaj.
Yeah, I will agree with Professor Shishir. Intelligence and surveillance are those two things that we need to take it on a priority, particularly from the Quad, because there should be something which is visible. It's not one-off that we do Malabar exercises and happy gung ho about it. It should not be like that. There should be continuity in the process. The second thing, I strongly believe there should be a national security advisors level interaction among the Quad members, because then we need to prioritize and feed into this 2+2 formation that look, these are the priority areas and we need to do it on a priority level. And defense technology, space and cyber are the three major areas where I think there are certain a potential and possibilities which is there, activities which should be planned across the year itself and between different members, and developing that kind of a camaraderie which is required in the Quad is, I will definitely welcome that kind of a thing. Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Pankaj. Thank you, and I'm sorry. There's a couple of really good questions come in, which I don't think we'll be able to get to given the time constraints. But talking about the role of potential role of Quad in helping to get India into a permanent role in the UN Security Council. That's a great point. But unfortunately, I'll have to draw proceedings to a close, and thank you both to our presenters for such an excellent presentations, and I think a really useful and valuable discussion. Certainly, I learnt a lot from both of you, and I certainly hope that everyone listening and watching also learnt a lot as well. So thank you very much, and thank you to JGU and to AII for working together for this this excellent webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care. Good day. Bye-bye.